This is flip video 5.1, the Phillips curve. So we are going to be adding a new graph to our collection of macroeconomic graphs here. And this graph that we're adding is called the Phillips curve. So before we look at this new graph, just a quick review of the output gaps and unemployment. We really need to understand what these gaps are and what they mean, because when we start drawing these on our Phillips curve, that's going to help us make sure we're placing the point in the correct spot. So no output gap is when the actual output equals potential output. So this is no output gap as we are at equilibrium. So this is where the actual unemployment rate equals the natural rate of unemployment. So remember, the natural rate of unemployment is frictional unemployment plus structural unemployment. And then our actual unemployment rate is cyclical unemployment plus the natural rate of unemployment. Our inflationary gap is that positive output gap. So this means unemployment is below the natural rate. So we are overemployed in our inflationary gap. And then our recessionary gap is the negative output gap, which means unemployment is above the natural rate, reflecting a lot of unemployment that's happening in our recession. So this is what our Phillips curve looks like. And our Phillips curve only focuses on the changes to inflation and unemployment. So we're not looking at changes to real GDP on our Phillips curve. We're only focusing on inflation and unemployment. So this is inflation. It is not pi. It is inflation. And then UR is our unemployment rate. And then we know what YF is. YF is our potential output. It's full employment. And then we have a new kind of label that we are looking at on our Phillips curve is this label, point A. So really the last time we've seen a letter point on a macroeconomic graph was our production possibilities curve. So what point A stands for, any other point that we could be asked to plot on our Phillips curve, this is the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So we can draw our Phillips curve with our market economy and show the same situation. So point A, or whatever point we're going to call it based on our problem that we're dealing with or our FRQ question, that just represents the intersection of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. So this Phillips curve is at equilibrium because we're on our YF point, we're on our full employment point here. So the short-run Phillips curve is this downward sloping curve, and it shows that negative relationship, so that inverse relationship between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. So as we start to move along the short-run Phillips curve, so for example, let's say we go from A to point B, we increase unemployment, but we're decreasing inflation. So showing that negative relationship that we have. Same thing if we move up the short-run Phillips curve, we go from A to B, we've decreased unemployment, but increased inflation. Again, showing that negative relationship that we have between inflation and unemployment. The long-run Phillips curve is our vertical curve on this graph here. And this shows the relationship between unemployment and inflation after expectations of inflation have had time to adjust. So basically our long-run Phillips curve says that in the long run, there is no relationship between inflation and unemployment. So in the long run, inflation and unemployment they don't have a relationship. They should technically remain the same. Our long-run Phillips curve, where we mark our full employment marker here, also represents the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which is just the natural rate of unemployment. So another way to phrase our natural rate of unemployment is the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. And our, kind of just to emphasize this point, our long-run Phillips curve show there's no long-run trade-off between unemployment and inflation. So in the long run, we are not going to experience a significant trade-off or any trade-off at all when we are experiencing changes to unemployment and inflation. So like I said earlier, our Phillips curve shows us very similar things that our market economy does. The only thing that our Phillips curve doesn't really show us is changes to real GDP. But we can always draw our market economy along with our Phillips curve, and we're going to read the same changes here. So when we have a change to aggregate demand, so remember any type of spending change, remember our aggregate demand curve represents our sig x equation. So any type of spending change that we have, we can reflect that on our Phillips curve as well. So whenever we have an aggregate demand shock or change in spending, we're going to move along our short-run Phillips curve. And it's just a movement along our short-run Phillips curve like we would do for a price change on our micro markets. So if we look at aggregate demand 2 is an increase here. So aggregate demand 2 is reflected on our short-run Phillips curve by moving up the short-run Phillips curve, by moving to the left. So we know that aggregate demand 2 and point B are moving in the same correction, or showing the same changes, because when we move aggregate demand to the right, we increase the price level and we have decreased the unemployment rate. Well, if we look at our Phillips curve, when we move to point B, we decrease the unemployment rate and we have increased the inflation rate. We're saying the same information. So if we look at aggregate demand 3, this decrease in demand, when we decrease aggregate demand, we move it to the right, we decrease price level, and we increase the unemployment rate. So on our Phillips curve, we reflect that by moving downward, or moving to the right on short-run Phillips curve to point C, increasing the unemployment rate and decreasing the inflation rate. Same information is being reflected here. Now if we look at changes to short-run aggregate supply, so any changes to production, we can also show those changes on our Phillips curve. So when we experience a change to short-run aggregate supply on our market economy, we're going to have an inverse change of our short-run Phillips curve. So if we look at an increase in short-run aggregate supply first, we have decreased unemployment and we have decreased the price level. So now if we go to our Phillips curve, we are going to short-run Phillips curve 2. We are shifting the inverse direction. So on the market economy, it goes to the right, but on our Phillips curve, it's going to go to the left. And we're not on equilibrium anymore. We're off equilibrium. So there's point B. Here's Y2, and then here's our inflation 2. So we've decreased inflation and we've decreased the unemployment rate. Same changes that we see on our market economy. Now if we look at our decrease in production, our decrease in production will increase unemployment and increase the price level. So if we look at that on our Phillips curve, we are going to move to the right. So again, an inverse change. So here we have short-run Phillips curve. I'll label this point C. We have increased the unemployment rate, and we are increasing the inflation rate. And then we can also reflect changes to long-run aggregate supply. So remember, this is our potential output. We can reflect that as well on our Phillips curve. So when we decrease long-run aggregate supply, remember we have to short-run change before the long-run change. So we have a decrease in short-run and then a decrease in long-run. And now when we reflect that on our Phillips curve, it's the inverse change. So short run Phillips curve is going to move to the right, and then long run Phillips curve is also going to move to the right, showing an increase in unemployment and an increase in inflation. Just like what we see on our market economy, an increase in unemployment and an increase in the price level. And then if we look at an increase in long run aggregate supply, well, short run aggregate supply is going to move to the right, and so will long run. But then on our Phillips curve, we have the inverse change. So we're going to move short run Phillips curve to the left and long run Phillips curve to the left, reflecting an increase in unemployment, a decrease in unemployment, and decrease in inflation. Same thing on our market economy. We've had a decrease in unemployment and a decrease in the price level. And that is our Phillips curve.